broke into your defenses and got into your city, and it was no holds barred. He could do whatever he wanted to or felt like doing once he got into the city. That was, again, the convention of warfare at the time. Muslims and Christian armies both practiced that aspect of warfare. Many of the people who were in the city were actually ransomed, so they were allowed to pay a ransom to the Crusaders and then be set free. Now, after so the First Crusade is successful. The Crusaders liberate the Holy City. They're able to go to the Basilica of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to fulfill their pilgrimage vow, and they receive the indulgence. And then many of them, actually most of them, left and went back home to France or Italy or Germany or England, wherever they had come from. Some did stay, and those who stayed created what are known as the Crusader States. And they stretch all the way from the north in Edessa all the way down to almost Egypt, with the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And in your workbook, we have a map that illustrates in the appendix the Crusader States. There were four main Crusader States: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Now, what happened in Jerusalem after the First Crusade was that Godfrey of Bouillon, who was one of the main crusade leaders on the First Crusade, was appointed and made defender of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. Now, he wasn't king of Jerusalem. His title was officially defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He dies, though, shortly after the First Crusade. He dies in the year 1100. The city of Jerusalem was liberated in 1099. Godfrey dies in 1100, so his brother, Baldwin, who had been the Count of Edessa, the first Crusader state, he comes down from Edessa and takes over control of Jerusalem and takes the title king. So in the year 1100, we have the first king, Christian king of Jerusalem, King Baldwin I, and he reigned for 18 years. Now, the Crusader states were very large. You look on your map, that frontier that the Christians had to guard against the Muslims was 600 miles. 600 miles from the county of Edessa all the way down to the very end of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. It's a large amount of territory to guard with not a lot of people left to be able to do it. So it's basically, to give us an image, it's basically the distance from Washington, D.C. to Toronto. Washington, D.C. to Toronto is the area that these men had to guard against the Muslims. And basically, the Crusaders only occupied a small strip of land on the coast. They were never able really to press in too far inland in order to expand their base of operations. So they were under constant threat of being attacked by the Muslims. Now, one of the things they had going for them is that the Muslims in the region at this time were not united. There were groups of different Muslims and different rulers who were not united and didn't really do things from a united perspective. There were the Sunni Muslims at the time who were under the Abbasid Caliphate, which was based in Baghdad. But in Egypt, there's a different caliphate, the Fatimid Caliphate, and they were Shiites in Egypt. So these two groups of Muslims, there were different rulers all throughout the Holy Land that had allegiance either to the Abbasid Caliphate or to the Fatimid Caliphate and were not united. And that was one of the reasons why the First Crusade was able to be successful, because the Muslims never presented a united front. So one of the greatest fears the Crusaders had was that the Muslims would unite and would push them out of the Crusader states. And we'll see that happen in a bit. Now, one of the ways in which the Crusaders dealt with their long frontier that they had to defend was they created and built a series of strategic fortifications known as Crusader castles in our day and age, all throughout the Holy Land at strategic points. And to guard and to man these castles, they gave these castles over to a new creation in the church's history at this time, the creation of military religious orders. See, crusading before the First Crusade, or during the First Crusade, was seen as a temporary act of devotion. It was something that a Western knight did temporarily. He undertook the vow, he went on crusade, he then came home and the crusade was over. It was a temporary act of devotion. But what happened after the First Crusade is we see the establishment of these religious military orders, the order of the warrior monks. And these men made crusading a permanent way of life. So these different orders were established. The Hospitallers, for example, the Templars, the Knights of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. All these religious orders were founded, these military orders were founded in order to guard the Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, and also to provide manpower to staff and man these castles and these strategic fortifications. So we'll talk more about the religious orders as we go through this session and our next session. So what happened, though, after the First Crusade, about 50 years after the First Crusade, we have a calling of the Second Crusade. And what happened during this time is a Muslim ruler by the name of Zengi, was a powerful Muslim ruler. He wanted to unite the Muslims, and he issued a jihad against the Christians who were living in the Holy Land. He wanted to push the Franks out of Palestine. So he attacks the city of Edessa, the first Crusader state that was established under Baldwin. And on Christmas Eve of 1144, the city falls. Zengi and his army go into the city of Edessa, and they massacre 6,000 Christian men, women, and children. So the great city of Edessa, the first Crusader state, falls. And this news reached Europe, and it caused a sensation. And so it also caused a response, the calling of the Second Crusade. So Pope Eugenius III is the man who issued a bull calling for the Second Crusade. Now, there hadn't been a crusade in a generation. Remember, the last crusade ended in 1099. We're now in the 1140s. So for 40 years, there had been no major crusading effort to the Holy Land. So again, this crusade had to be preached, and warrior knights in Europe had to be encouraged to go on the crusade. And so how that happened was through the preaching of one very important man in the history of the church, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. One historian has said the Second Crusade was born by papal announcement, but it drew breath from the words of Bernard of Clairvaux. So Saint Bernard of Clairvaux was a very holy man, was a member of the Cistercian order, and actually helped spread the Cistercian order all throughout Europe. He was described as being slender, handsome, very fair, kind, and charming of manner, but passionate and full of inner fire. His mother had raised him in total devotion to the Catholic faith, with a particular emphasis on the Blessed Virgin Mary. St. Bernard had a great devotion to the Blessed Mother, so much so that he even wrote a prayer that we still say today, the Memorare. So where we receive that prayer is from St. Bernard. He had a wonderful devotion to Our Lady. And again, he contributed to the spread of the Cistercian order throughout Europe. In particular, he founded the monastery at Clairvaux. When he started that monastery in 1115, there were only 12 companions with him. By the time of his death in 1153, there were 700 men in that monastery. So it was a huge, huge growth. Remember how I've said in previous sessions that holiness attracts. People are attracted to holiness, and these men saw the holiness of St. Bernard, and they wanted to be with him in Clairvaux and dedicate their lives to God. St. Bernard is also important because he wrote commentaries on the scriptures, he wrote many theological works, and even hymns. So he preached the Second Crusade. He was very involved in the Second Crusade movement. He wanted the Crusaders the European knights to go to the Holy Land, and again to defend the Holy Land against the Muslim threat. He and his Cistercians were spread all throughout Europe preaching the Second Crusade. He even went to the royal court in France and preached to the king, King Louis VII. And King Louis VII was married to Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, who would later on divorce him and then marry Henry II, the Plantagenet king of England. But at the royal court, when Bernard preached the crusade, so many knights at the court took the vow, publicly took the cross to go on crusade, that the prepared crosses that Bernard had with him to hand them when they took their vow to be sewn onto their cloaks, he ran out of those prepared crosses. So he actually had to rip his own habit, rip the fabric off his own habit to make crosses to give to the men who vowed to go on crusade. It was such a huge response from his great preaching. So the French army gathers around King Louis VII. There was also an army from Germany, led by the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III. Now the German army leaves in May of 1147 and arrives in Constantinople. They then are shipped across the Bosphorus to Nicaea, and they decide to make their way to Antioch. Now, as they're marching through Anatolia on their way to Antioch, taking the same route as the First Crusade, they're attacked by Muslims, they're encircled, a big battle ensues, and unfortunately the German army is mostly decimated. The Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and some of his knights are able to escape the battle and make their way to Antioch, and then eventually they make their way to Jerusalem. So at this point, things aren't looking good for the Second Crusade. One of the major armies has already suffered a very large defeat. Now, King Louis VII, with his wife Eleanor of Aquitaine, land at Nicaea, and they travel along down the coast with their army. All along the way during their travel, they're harassed by the Turkish Muslims, and they're also even harassed by the Byzantines, if you can believe it. This is one of the reasons for the crusade, was to go and help the Byzantines. But the Byzantines were not, again, we've talked about this tension between East and West over the last several sessions. The Byzantines weren't happy at the size of the Western armies that appeared in their land. And they weren't also happy that many of the Crusaders who came on the First Crusade kept Byzantine land instead of giving it back to them after they liberated it from the Muslims. So there was this animosity that still existed between the Western Knights and the Byzantines. So King Louis VII is not only having to fight the Muslims, he's also fighting schismatic Christians who are hindering his way to Jerusalem. Eventually he gets to a point where he realizes he can't travel over land anymore. He's taking too many casualties, so he asks the Byzantines to provide him ships to transport his army to Jerusalem via the sea. Unfortunately, the Byzantines only provide enough ships for a small portion of his army. Imagine that. So what he does is he has a very tough decision, very difficult decision as a leader of men to decide who's going to go on the ships and who's going to try to make their way to Jerusalem over land. So he divvies up his army and he sails off to Jerusalem. The vast majority of his army that remained on land and tried to make their way to Jerusalem were easily picked off and decimated by the Turks. So here we have the Second Crusade. The whole point of the crusade was to go and recapture the city of Edessa that had been taken by Zengi, that Muslim ruler. Now we have the German army has been mostly decimated, the French army has been mostly decimated, so the Crusaders are no longer in a position of strength to do much of anything. But King Louis VII and Conrad III meet in Jerusalem to discuss their plan of action and what they're going to do. Now what happened during this time is before this actually, Zengi in 1146 dies. He's killed by one of his slaves whom he had slighted. So Zengi dies. His son is the man by the name of Nur-ad-Din. Nur-ad-Din now becomes the ruler of the areas where Zengi once ruled. Now Nur-ad-Din marries the daughter of the city of Damascus. And so there's a fear among the Crusaders that this Nur-ad-Din is going to unite now all of Muslim Syria against the Crusaders. He's not only in control of the city of Aleppo, now he's in control of the city of Damascus, and he presents a very strong, united front against the Crusaders. So eventually he would become leader of all of Muslim Syria in 1154. And again, he took on the goal of his father to push the Franks out of Jerusalem and push them out of the Holy Land. So again, the Crusaders were afraid that Nur-ad-Din would gain control of Damascus and launch an attack against Jerusalem. So Louis and Conrad decide to, instead of going and trying to liberate Edessa, they're going to go and attack Damascus. So militarily, this was a smart thing to do in terms of strategy, but in terms of tactics, they didn't have enough soldiers really to accomplish a siege of Damascus. But they tried nonetheless. So they arrive at the city of Damascus in July of 1148. It's a very short siege. It lasts all of 4 days. And the reason why the siege only lasted 4 days was because the Crusaders first occupied on the western part of the city a strong defensive position that was near an orchard to provide them food and was near a water source as well. But they didn't have enough men in the army to encircle the entire city to try to cut off supplies and relief forces coming into the city. So they concentrated on the western side, but they knew on the eastern side of the city, the Muslims were bringing in troops, fresh troops and supplies into the city. So they knew that they weren't going to be able to have a successful siege unless they stopped the flow of troops and material in the city on the eastern side. So they left this good defensive position that gave them food and water, and they moved over to the eastern side of the city where they began to starve and run out of water and run out of material, and it just became an untenable situation. So they eventually had to decide to call the siege off and call the crusade off. So the Second Crusade ended in complete and utter disaster. The armies were decimated before they could even get to their objective, which was Edessa, and then they didn't have enough men in order to go up to Edessa and besiege it, and then the political situation changed in the Holy Land so that they had to attack a different city. And when they did so, they didn't do it well, they weren't well prepared, and they ended up losing and leaving. Now the effect on the failure of the Second Crusade was major. There would not be another crusade for another generation, for another 40 years. There would not be another crusade. There was no more call to try to go and rescue and liberate the city of Edessa. Now the worst fear of the Crusaders in the Holy Land, which we've talked about, is this fear that there would be one central, powerful Muslim ruler who would come and unite not only the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, and bring both of those two caliphates together and form one just impregnable force in order to push them out of the Holy Land. And what happens, this fear, unfortunately, 30 years after the failure of the Second Crusade, is realized with the arrival of an important man in history, a man by the name of Saladin. Saladin is this great Muslim general. He was actually a Kurd born in the city of Tikrit. which if we know our modern history, Tikrit was the birthplace of Saddam Hussein from Iraq. And so actually Saddam Hussein tried to portray himself as being a modern-day Saladin, fighting the Western Crusaders, and had all this imagery associated with this period of time. But what happens in the 12th century is Saladin, in 1171, on the order of Nur ad-Din, deposes the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo. So Saladin is in Egypt at this time. He deposes the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, removes the Shiite Muslims from power in Egypt, and instead unites the Egyptian Muslims with the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad. So now the worst fear of the Crusaders has been realized. Both caliphates are united, and Saladin is on the march. Saladin preaches a jihad against the Crusaders. He's a deeply religious man who wants to unify all the Muslims into one powerful state and get rid of the Crusaders, specifically from Jerusalem, to reconquer the holy city of Jerusalem. He launches a series of raids into the Crusader territory over the next several years, from 1170 to 1184. He's constantly raiding in the Crusader territory, trying to wear down the Crusaders and wear down their defenses. Now, the king of the kingdom of Jerusalem at this time is a man by the name of Baldwin IV. And Baldwin IV is known in history as the leper king, because he was a young man who did suffer from the disease of leprosy. Despite his disease, he was a very strong and effective king, and also a very effective military ruler. But he dies in 1185 at the age of 24. And what happens is a series of political maneuverings in the kingdom that results in his sister, Sibylla, becoming queen. And Sibylla was married to a man by the name of Guy de Lusignan. And Guy was a horribly ineffective, bad ruler. Not only was he a bad political ruler, but he was a horrible military commander, a horrible leader of men. So Sibylla becomes queen. She then crowns her husband Guy king. And so this is the situation we have in the kingdom of Jerusalem at this time. Now, several years ago, there was a movie that was made about the events leading up to what we're going to talk about here in a minute, the Third Crusade, and it talks about Saladin and portrays Saladin and this whole issue of Baldwin IV and Sibylla and Guy, and it was called The Kingdom of Heaven. It was directed by Ridley Scott. It had Jeremy Irons in it. Liam Neeson was in it briefly. It has Orlando Bloom plays the major main character of the story. And the story is centered, this movie is centered, but by the way, it's a horribly inaccurate historically inaccurate movie, and even not necessarily a good movie as a whole, and we'll see why in a minute. But it talks about, it takes place around this period of time with the rise of Saladin and the fall of Jerusalem right before the Third Crusade. And so it is interesting, Orlando Bloom is mostly known for his role as Legolas in the Lord of the Rings trilogies. And so just keep that in mind when we come to a story, when we talk about the end of the capture of Jerusalem, is who plays the main character in this movie. So what happens is Saladin invades the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187 en masse. He marches against the city of Tiberias, which is in the north near Galilee. The city falls, but the citadel holds out. So within these cities, there was always a city wall in the city itself, and people lived inside the city, but there was always a citadel where the troops were garrisoned. And that was usually the most fortified position in a city during this period of time. And so you could capture the city, but you might not be able to capture the citadel. The soldiers might be able to still hold out. So Saladin captured the city of Tiberias, but the citadel actually held out against him. So there was discussion among the Crusader nobles as to what to do. King Guy held a council of war to figure out what should we do. Saladin has marched en masse into our territory. He's captured the city of Tiberias. What is our plan of action? Remember I said that Guy is not an effective military commander at all. So what he decides to do is he decides to assemble the largest Christian army that was seen at that time or any future time in the Holy Land. An army about 20,000 men strong. But what he does in order to accomplish or to bring that army together, he empties most of the garrisons of all of the Christian cities in the Holy Land. So he brings the Hospitaller Knights with him, the Templar Knights with him, Knights of the Holy Sepulchre. He has very few remaining knights left to guard his cities. So if his army was to be destroyed in the field, there would be no defense against Saladin's Muslim army from capturing and taking the rest of the Crusader states. So some nobles actually argued against Guy assembling this army and marching towards Tiberias. Instead, they wanted to have a more defensive position and just wait Saladin out. Guy doesn't listen to them. He decides to march his army through the desert, through the summer heat. This is in July of 1187. Marches them through the heat outside the city of Tiberias, or on his way to Tiberias. On the